The Morgan family was the embodiment of American success, their picturesque life tucked away behind the gates of an exclusive community in the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut. To anyone who knew them, Thomas and Isabel Morgan were the epitome of what it meant to make it. Wealthy, elegant, influential, their sprawling mansion stood as a testament to years of hard work and a relentless pursuit of the American dream. Isabel, with her graceful charm, had left behind a budding career in interior design to become the perfect homemaker, effortlessly balancing charity functions and social gatherings with her role as a mother to Clara, her 19-year-old daughter from her first marriage. Clara, a bright, beautiful young woman, was getting ready to start her sophomore year at Columbia University, with dreams of following in her biological father's footsteps as an international diplomat. On the outside, the Morgans' life seemed flawless, a well-crafted facade of affluence and happiness. Neighbors in the gated community whispered about how fortunate Isabel was to have found such a stable, successful second husband in Thomas. But no one could have predicted that beneath this polished exterior, a darker, more sinister truth lurked, threatening to unravel their perfect lives and destroy everything they had built. The Morgan story began, like many others among the affluent elite. It was at a charity gala in the spring of 2010 that Thomas and Isabel first met. Isabel had recently divorced her first husband, a cold and distant politician who had been more interested in his career than his family. Raising Claire on her own had not been easy, even with Isabel's success as an interior designer. That night, however, she wasn't thinking about work. She was thinking about how lonely life had become and how much she longed for a second chance at happiness. Thomas, 38 at the time, was already a rising star in the world of finance. His charm, good looks, and sharp mind had made him one of the most sought-after men in his circle. When he spotted Isabel across the room, he was immediately captivated by her beauty and poise. Approaching her with a glass of champagne, he introduced himself, and what followed was a whirlwind romance that swept both of them off their feet. Within 6 months, Thomas proposed, presenting Isabel with a stunning diamond ring that quickly became the envy of her social circle. Their wedding, held at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, was a grand affair, attended by politicians, Wall Street titans, and celebrities alike. Clara, who was only 7 at the time, served as the flower girl, her bright eyes filled with hope and joy as she watched her mother marry the man who would become her stepfather. For several years, life seemed idyllic. Thomas's career continued to flourish with promotions and bonuses that allowed the Morgans to live in unparalleled luxury. Isabel, always the doting mother, threw herself into her new role as a socialite and homemaker. She organized charity galas, hosted lavish dinner parties, and volunteered on school boards, cementing the Morgan status as one of the most admired families in their community. Meanwhile, Clara grew into a smart, capable young woman, her academic achievements at prestigious prep schools making her the pride of her mother. But, as with all seemingly perfect lives, there were cracks beneath the surface. Over time, the novelty of their life together began to fade. Thomas's long hours at the office, late-night business dinners, and constant travel began to take a toll on their marriage. Isabel, who had given up her career to support his, found herself increasingly isolated in their massive, empty home. She tried to keep busy, but charity work and social events no longer filled the void that had formed between them. Conversations between her and Thomas, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, had dwindled to brief discussions about Clara's school schedule or household matters. By the time Clara entered high school, the Morgan household had become a place of quiet tension. Thomas and Isabel slept in separate bedrooms, a fact they casually attributed to his loud snoring whenever friends asked. But the truth was far less innocent. Their marriage had grown cold, a loveless partnership that neither was willing to end. Isabel threw herself into Clara's life, living vicariously through her daughter's achievements, while Thomas buried himself in his work, their interactions growing more distant with each passing day. Clara, now a young woman on the verge of adulthood, had long since noticed the shift in her family dynamic. Her relationship with Thomas had always been complicated. In the early years of their marriage, he had been a loving stepfather, attending her ballet recitals and helping with school projects. But as his marriage to Isabel cooled, so did his involvement in Clara's life. Though she admired Thomas for his intellect and success, there was always an emotional distance between them. It wasn't until Clara's senior year of high school that everything began to change. At 18, Clara had blossomed into a stunning young woman, and Thomas had started taking a renewed interest in her life. He attended her school events again, showing up at her dance recitals and academic competitions, his eyes tracking her every movement. Their conversations, once perfunctory, grew deeper, expanding beyond her college plans to her views on politics, philosophy, and the world at large. Clara found herself enjoying these late-night talks with Thomas, seeking his attention more and more. It wasn't just the attention that drew her in. It was the way Thomas made her feel seen, heard, and valued. Clara had spent much of her life trying to gain her mother's approval, but now Thomas was treating her like an equal, a young woman whose opinions mattered. Their relationship, once defined by the boundaries of father and stepdaughter, began to blur. What started as innocent late-night talks in the study while Isabel slept soon became something more. Isabel, initially pleased by the growing bond between Thomas and Clara, began to feel a creeping sense of unease as their interactions became more frequent. At first, she brushed it off. After all, wasn't it a good thing that Thomas was finally showing an interest in the family again? But as the months went on, Isabel couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It was in the way Thomas's gaze lingered just a little too long on Clara, the way their private jokes excluded her from the conversation, the way they seemed to move through the house, as though Isabel wasn't even there. The first real moment of doubt came during a family dinner. Isabel had invited a few friends over to discuss plans for an upcoming fundraiser, and Clara had joined them at the table. As they talked, Isabel caught Thomas staring at Clara from across the room, his eyes fixed on her as she laughed at one of the guests' jokes. The look in his eyes wasn't the pride of a father watching his daughter. It was something else, something that made Isabel's stomach turn. From that moment on, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She began watching Thomas and Clara more closely, noticing the way their conversation stopped abruptly whenever she entered the room, the way Clara's hand would linger on Thomas's arm just a little too long during their talks. Clara, once so open with her mother, had become secretive, spending more and more time alone with Thomas under the guise of college prep or career advice. The tension in the house grew thicker with each passing day. Isabel tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that there was no way Thomas would ever betray her, especially not with Clara. But the evidence was mounting, and no matter how hard Isabel tried to ignore it, she couldn't escape the sinking feeling that her marriage, her family, was unraveling before her eyes. As Clara's high school graduation approached, the Morgan household became a pressure cooker of unspoken desires and simmering resentment. Isabel found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with questions she was too afraid to ask. What if she confronted Thomas and Clara, only to have her worst fears confirmed? What if she was wrong, and this was all in her head? It was during a casual lunch with a close friend that Isabel's worst fears began to solidify. Over coffee and pastries, her friend casually mentioned that she had seen Thomas and Clara together at a cafe downtown, having what appeared to be a deep conversation. At first, Isabel brushed it off, laughing awkwardly as she dismissed the comment. But later that night, as she lay in bed, the seed of doubt took root, growing into a gnawing certainty that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Isabel's world, once so perfectly ordered, was about to come crashing down. And when it did, no one, not Thomas, not Clara, not Isabel herself, would be spared from the destruction that followed. The summer before Clara's freshman year at Columbia should have been a time of excitement and preparation, but for Isabel, it was anything but. The unsettling feeling that had taken root during that lunch with her friend had grown into a full-blown obsession. She couldn't stop thinking about that conversation, about the look in Thomas' eyes whenever he glanced at Clara. Isabel tried to rationalize it, tried to convince herself that she was being paranoid, but the doubt gnawed at her relentlessly. Thomas and Clara's relationship seemed to evolve overnight. They spent more time together than ever, going out for long drives under the pretense of discussing Clara's college plans, disappearing into the study late at night to work on her internship applications, or so they said. Isabel began to feel like a third wheel in her own home, excluded from conversations and activities, as if she were an outsider looking in on a family she no longer belonged to. At first, Isabel tried to confront her fears in small, passive ways. She'd casually ask Thomas about his day, or about his time with Clara, watching his reaction carefully for any hint of guilt or discomfort. But Thomas had always been a master of appearances, cool, collected, with an air of unshakable confidence. If he felt any guilt about his increasingly close relationship with Clara, he certainly didn't show it. In fact, he seemed happier than he had in years, a sharp contrast to the distant, work-obsessed man Isabel had grown accustomed to. Clara, too, seemed different. She had always been a confident young woman, but now she carried herself with an air of sophistication and maturity that went beyond her years. Isabel noticed the way she dressed more carefully, choosing outfits that subtly accentuated her figure. and how she would light up whenever Thomas complimented her on her looks or achievements. There was an energy between them, an electric current that Isabel couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. The tension in the house became suffocating. Every interaction, every glance, was charged with an undercurrent of something unspoken. Isabel's once stable world felt like it was teetering on the edge of collapse, and she didn't know how to stop it. One evening, Isabel decided to put her fears to rest once and for all. She had to know if what she suspected was real or just the product of her overactive imagination. She had overheard Thomas telling Clara that he was taking a trip to the city to check on some properties he was managing. Clara had mentioned something about needing his help with an internship interview. It wasn't unusual for them to spend time together, but something about the way they spoke, too casually, too easily, made Isabel's stomach churn. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When Thomas left that afternoon, Isabel waited until she heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then she grabbed her keys and followed him, her heart pounding as she kept her distance on the road. It wasn't long before Thomas' car veered off the highway, taking an exit that didn't lead toward the properties he was supposedly visiting. Isabel's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she followed him down a winding road, past a row of small shops and cafes, until his car finally stopped in front of a small, unassuming inn just outside the city. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled over to the side of the road, parking just out of sight. Thomas stepped out of the car, looking around briefly before heading inside. He didn't check in, didn't go to the front desk. He simply walked in as if he had been there before. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. Isabel sat frozen in her car, torn between the overwhelming need to know the truth and the terror of discovering it. She watched as Thomas emerged from the inn just moments later, followed closely by Clara. They didn't look around, didn't seem concerned that anyone might see them. It was as if they were invisible to the world around them, wrapped up in whatever they were hiding. The sight of Clara walking beside Thomas, her hand brushing his arm as they laughed together, was like a punch to Isabel's gut. She felt the bile rise in her throat as she watched them drive away, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had just seen. This wasn't a father-daughter outing. This was something else. Something darker, something that Isabel had been too afraid to confront until now. When she returned home, Isabel felt like she was suffocating. Her chest tightened as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The reality of what she had witnessed was almost too much to bear. She had known deep down that something was wrong for months, but now she had seen it with her own eyes. There was no denying it anymore. Thomas and Clara were involved in something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. But what could she do? Confronting them meant tearing apart her family, destroying the life she had built. It meant admitting to herself that she had been blind to the truth for so long. Isabel's mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? How deep did their relationship go? And, most terrifying of all, what would happen if she exposed them? She couldn't confront them, not yet, not without proof. That night, while Thomas and Clara slept, Isabel found herself pacing the halls of the mansion, her mind running through every possibility, every potential outcome. She couldn't stand the thought of letting this continue, of watching them carry on their affair right under her nose. But she also knew that confronting them too soon, without any evidence, could backfire. Thomas was a master manipulator. He could easily turn the situation against her, paint her as paranoid or unstable. No, Isabel needed something more concrete. She needed undeniable proof of their betrayal. The next morning, while Thomas was at work and Clara was at the gym, Isabel made her move. She installed hidden cameras in the house, small unobtrusive devices that could capture everything happening in the key areas where Thomas and Clara spent time together. The study, the living room, the kitchen. She told herself that it wasn't about spying on them. It was about protecting her family, about ensuring that she wasn't losing her mind. As the days passed, the footage began to pile up. At first, there was nothing too damning, just casual interactions, small moments that could easily be dismissed as normal. But as the weeks went on, Isabel began to see the truth unfold before her eyes. Thomas and Clara's relationship had crossed a line. There was no mistaking it anymore. The way they touched, the way they spoke to each other, the lingering glances that held far more than familial affection. Isabel watched in horror as the proof of their affair played out in front of her. She felt as though she were watching a nightmare unfold, powerless to stop it. The betrayal was worse than she had imagined, worse because it wasn't just physical. There was an emotional bond between them, a connection that had been built over time, right under her nose. With each passing day, the weight of their secret grew heavier, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything other than the footage on her laptop, the damning evidence that would soon destroy everything. But what could she do with it? How could she confront them without losing everything in the process? If she exposed their affair, the fallout would be catastrophic. Thomas would lose his career, their family's reputation would be ruined, and Clara's life would be shattered. Yet, Isabel knew she couldn't keep silent forever. The truth would come out. It had to. And when it did, there would be no going back. The truth was like poison coursing through Isabel's veins. Every waking moment was consumed by the knowledge that her husband and daughter, her own flesh and blood, were involved in something unspeakable. She had tried to find a way to live with it, tried to convince herself that maybe she could stop it before it went any further. But deep down, she knew that it was already too late. The evidence from the hidden cameras was undeniable. Their affair had crossed all boundaries of morality, and now Isabel found herself trapped, suffocated by the weight of what she had uncovered. As summer turned to fall and Clara's sophomore year at Columbia began, Isabel's paranoia only grew worse. Clara spent most of her time away at school, but when she came home on weekends, Isabel's anxiety spiked. Every time she saw Clara and Thomas together, it was like reliving the nightmare all over again. The way Clara laughed at his jokes, the way Thomas brushed against her when he walked by, it made Isabel sick. She began avoiding them, retreating to her room with some excuse about a headache or charity work that needed her attention. But in truth, she was hiding from the reality that had taken over her life. Thomas, of course, seemed oblivious to Isabel's growing distress. He had always been a man of precision and control, compartmentalizing every aspect of his life with ease. He thrived in the structured world of finance, where emotions were a liability and results were everything. But now, Isabel saw that same cold detachment in his personal life. He showed no signs of guilt, no hesitation when it came to his relationship with Clara. In fact, he seemed more at ease than he had in years, like a man who had finally found something he thought he had lost long ago. The burden of the secret weighed heavily on Clara as well. She had grown up craving her mother's approval, and now she had become the very thing that would destroy Isabel. Clara knew the relationship with Thomas was wrong. She knew it deep in her bones. But the thrill of their affair, the way he made her feel, was intoxicating. The more Clara tried to pull away, the more she found herself drawn back in. It was a dangerous game, and she knew it wouldn't end well. Yet she was trapped, just like Isabel, unable to break free from the web of lies and deceit that had ensnared them both. Isabel's breaking point came one late autumn afternoon. The leaves had just begun to turn, the fiery reds and oranges painting a picture-perfect scene in their quiet Connecticut neighborhood. Clara had come home for the weekend, and Isabel had tried, once again, to pretend that everything was normal. She had gone through the motions of preparing a family dinner, cooking Clara's favorite meal, but her hands shook as she set the table. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken words and lingering stares. Thomas and Clara arrived home together from what they claimed was a trip to the local farmer's market. Isabel watched from the kitchen window as they got out of the car, laughing about something that only they seemed to understand. Her chest tightened as she saw Clara reach for Thomas's arm, a gesture that was too familiar, too intimate for a stepfather and his stepdaughter. Isabel's heart raced as they entered the house, the sound of their laughter echoing in the hallway like a cruel reminder of the secret they shared. Dinner that evening was unbearable. Isabel could barely eat, her stomach churning with every passing moment. Thomas and Clara carried on as if nothing was wrong, discussing Clara's classes, Thomas's business trips, and the upcoming holidays. But Isabel heard none of it. All she could focus on was the way Thomas looked at Clara, the way Clara's eyes lit up whenever he spoke. It was a performance, a carefully crafted lie that was playing out from right in front of her, and she was the only one who knew the truth. When dinner was over, Isabel excused herself and went upstairs to her room. She couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't sit there and pretend that everything was fine. The walls were closing in on her, and she felt like she was drowning. The hidden cameras had given her all the proof she needed, but now what? She couldn't confront them, couldn't expose them without destroying everything they had built. But how could she continue living like this? In a moment of desperation, Isabel did something she had never imagined she would do. She called a private investigator. It had taken weeks for her to work up the nerve, but she had done her research. The investigator she hired was discreet, highly recommended, and experienced in cases just like hers. His name was Robert Danner, a former NYPD detective who had built a career on uncovering the dirty secrets of the wealthy and powerful. Isabel explained the situation over the phone, leaving out no details, and within days, Robert had begun tailing Thomas and Clara whenever they were together. At first, the surveillance yielded little more than what Isabel already knew. Robert followed them to cafes, bookstores, and the university, documenting their every move. They were careful, always maintaining an air of propriety in public, never lingering too long, or showing any signs of inappropriate behavior. But Isabel knew better. She knew what happened behind closed doors. It wasn't until the weekend before Thanksgiving that Robert uncovered the evidence Isabel had been dreading. Thomas and Clara had driven out to a secluded cabin in the woods, a place Isabel knew well. It was their family's vacation home, tucked away in a remote corner of the state. Isabel had always thought of it as a place of peace and solitude, but now it felt like a prison, a cage where her husband and daughter's betrayal had taken root. When Robert sent Isabel the photographs, her heart sank. There, in black and white, were the images she had feared most. Thomas and Clara, standing close together by the fireplace, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that left no room for doubt. The look in Thomas's eyes, the way Clara leaned into him, it was all there, captured in the stark clarity of the camera's lens. Isabel stared at the photographs for what felt like hours, her mind numb. She had known this was coming. She had known it for months. But seeing it, holding the proof in her hands, was something else entirely. The betrayal cut deeper than she had ever imagined. Her husband, the man she had built her life with, had fallen in love with her daughter, and Clara, her beautiful, intelligent daughter, had become complicit in this nightmare. The house was quiet that night. Thomas had gone to bed early, exhausted from his latest business trip, or so he claimed. Clara was in her room, supposedly studying for an upcoming exam. Isabel sat alone in the living room, the photographs spread out on the coffee table in front of her. Her heart ached with the weight of what she had to do next. There was no going back now. The truth was out, and there was no way to bury it. Isabel's world had officially unraveled, but now the only thing left was to confront it head-on. The weight of what she had uncovered sat heavily on her chest, as if she were suffocating beneath the enormity of her family's betrayal. There was no longer any way to avoid the truth, no matter how devastating it was. That weekend, Clara returned home for Thanksgiving, and the atmosphere inside the Morgan home felt oppressively tense. Isabel moved through the motions, preparing for the holiday like she always had, but this year was different. The warmth and joy that had once accompanied the festive season were absent. She couldn't bring herself to feel anything but cold dread. The house, decorated in shades of autumn, with pumpkins and wreaths adorning the front door, was picture perfect. But just like everything else in Isabel's life, it was only a facade. Beneath the surface, there was rot, deception, lies, and betrayal that had eaten away at the foundation of her family. Isabel could feel it with every glance between Thomas and Clara, every shared laugh and unspoken word. She was on the outside now, a spectator in her own life. Isabel had planned the confrontation for days, playing out the scenario in her mind over and over again, trying to figure out how best to approach it. She knew it would be explosive. There was no way around that. But she also knew that if she didn't handle it carefully, the fallout would be catastrophic. The Morgans were a prominent family in their community, respected by neighbors and friends alike. The truth of their scandal would not only destroy their family, but also tarnish the reputation they had worked so hard to build. But Isabel couldn't live with it anymore. She couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine, while her husband and daughter carried on with their affair. The decision to confront them wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. The night before Thanksgiving, Isabel lay awake in bed, her mind racing. Thomas had gone to bed hours earlier, and Clara was in her room, studying for her exams. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant sound of a car passing by on the street. But inside Isabel's mind, there was no peace. Her thoughts swirled like a storm, a chaotic mix of anger, fear, and sorrow. She had spent so long trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to understand how her marriage had fallen apart so completely. At what point had she lost Thomas? When had he turned his attention from her to Clara? Isabel replayed every interaction between them, every moment she had dismissed or ignored. She saw it all so clearly now, how the distance between her and Thomas had grown over the years, how he had stopped looking at her the way he used to, how his focus had shifted entirely to her daughter. But it wasn't just Thomas who had betrayed her. Clara, too, had made a choice. A choice to betray her mother, to engage in a relationship that should never have happened. Isabel's anger at Thomas was matched only by her sorrow for Clara. She had raised her daughter with so much love, given her everything she could, and yet, in the end, Clara had chosen Thomas. Isabel's heart ached with the weight of that realization. The next morning, Thanksgiving Day, dawned cold and crisp. The early morning frost clung to the windows as Isabel prepared the turkey, her hands moving mechanically as she basted the bird, chopped vegetables, and set the table. The house smelled of rosemary and sage, the scents of the holiday filling the air, but it all felt hollow to Isabel. This was supposed to be a time of family and togetherness, but for her, it was a reminder of how fractured their lives had become. Thomas and Clara eventually joined her in the kitchen, their faces bright with forced cheerfulness. They acted as if nothing was wrong, as if the last few months hadn't been filled with lies and deception. Isabel could barely look at them, her stomach churning with disgust. How could they sit there and pretend that everything was normal? As the day wore on, Isabel watched them closely. The way Thomas poured Clara a glass of wine, the way Clara laughed at his jokes, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The scenes played out before her like a twisted parody of a happy family. But Isabel saw it for what it was, an affair hidden in plain sight, and no one, not even Clara, seemed to care. That evening after dinner, Isabel's resolve hardened. She couldn't let this go on any longer. She had tried to hold it together for the sake of appearances, but it was too much now. The charade had to end. Isabel took a deep breath and went to the living room, where she retrieved the photographs the private investigator had sent her. The images, stark and undeniable, showed Thomas and Clara together at the secluded cabin. They weren't just spending time together, they were lovers. The proof was there, in black and white. And Isabel knew that once she confronted them with it, there would be no going back. That night, after Thomas and Clara had gone to bed, Isabel sat in the darkened living room, the photographs spread out in front of her. She stared at them, her mind summed. This was it. The moment everything would change. Her family, her marriage, her life. It would all be destroyed. But as much as Isabel hated what was happening, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She took one last look at the photographs, her heart heavy, and then she carefully placed them back in the envelope. Tomorrow, she would confront them. Tomorrow, she would end this nightmare once and for all. The following morning, the day after Thanksgiving, dawned gray and dreary. Isabel woke with a sense of dread settling in the pit of her stomach, knowing that by the end of the day, her life would never be the same. She moved through the motions of the morning, preparing breakfast, cleaning up after dinner, but all the while, her mind was focused on the confrontation that was to come. As Thomas and Clara sat at the breakfast table, chatting about Clara's return to campus, Isabel felt a wave of nausea wash over her. They were so casual, so unaffected by what they had done. It was as if they believed they could continue living this lie indefinitely, as if they thought Isabel would never catch on. But she had. When the moment finally came, Isabel didn't hesitate. She went to the study and retrieved the envelope, her hands steady as she walked back into the kitchen. Thomas looked up at her, confused, but Clara's face paled the moment she saw the envelope in her mother's hand. She knew what was coming. She could see it in Isabel's eyes. Without a word, Isabel placed the photographs on the table in front of them. The images spilled out. Their damning evidence spread across the surface, like pieces of a shattered life. Thomas's expression changed in an instant, from confusion to shock to something darker. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she reached for the photographs. But Isabel stopped her. There was no need to say anything. The truth was right there, in front of them, undeniable. The affair, the betrayal, the lies. It was all laid bare. Isabel stood there, her heart racing, waiting for the explosion. But it didn't come. The house was silent, the weight of the truth pressing down on them all. Thomas and Clara sat frozen, staring at the photographs, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Isabel watched them, her heart pounding in her chest. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, she felt nothing but emptiness. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, had led to this. The day after Isabel's confrontation, the air in the Morgan house felt heavy, suffocating. Tension radiated from every corner of the home. The photographs had shattered any hope of hiding their secrets, leaving behind only raw betrayal and silence. The family was fractured, irreparable. Isabel spent most of the day in her room, trying to process the weight of what she had done. The truth was now out in the open, but the aftermath had only just begun. Clara stayed in her room, and Thomas left the house early in the morning, claiming he had business to attend to, though Isabel suspected he was simply escaping the storm. As the afternoon wore on, Isabel's thoughts became darker, clouded by the pain of betrayal. She wandered the halls of the house, aimless, her mind replaying the images of Thomas and Clara together. Everything she had sacrificed, everything she had been. By early evening, the tension reached its breaking point. It happened in an instant, without warning or hesitation. The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the quiet neighborhood, sharp and unmistakable. The noise startled the birds resting on nearby trees, sending them flying into the sky in a chaotic flurry. The gunshot came from within the Morgan home. Shot across the street, Beatrice Hernandez, the Morgan's next-door neighbor, was tending to her garden when she heard the gunfire. Her heart raced as she stood frozen, unsure of what she had just heard. But as the realization settled in, she dropped her gardening tools and ran toward the Morgan house. She reached the front door just as Thomas Morgan burst out, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. Blood stained the front of his shirt, and he looked as if he had seen a ghost. Beatrice froze in place, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Without a word, Thomas ran past her, disappearing into the night. Beatrice stood there, trembling, unsure of whether to call for help or follow him. A chill ran down her spine, and she slowly walked toward the door, now slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened as she peeked inside, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the hallway, lay Clara, motionless. Blood pooled around her body, seeping into the cracks of the hardwood floor. Beatrice backed away, her hands shaking. The world seemed to spin as she ran back to her house, grabbing her phone and dialing 911. Her voice trembled as she gave the dispatcher the address, explaining that a gunshot had been fired, that someone was hurt, possibly dead. Within minutes, the police arrived, the flashing lights of their cars illuminating the quiet suburban street. Detective Sarah Donovan, who had dealt with her fair share of tragic cases, led the investigation. She had been on the force for over a decade, and cases involving family disputes were all too common. But this one felt different. The scene inside the Morgan house was grim. Clara was dead, a gunshot wound to the chest the apparent cause. Paramedics confirmed there was nothing they could do to save her. The air was thick with grief and tension, the kind of atmosphere that only comes from the violent unraveling of a once perfect family. Detective Donovan directed her team to secure the area while she began gathering witness statements. Beatrice Hernandez was the first person she interviewed. Still visibly shaken, Beatrice recounted what she had heard and seen: the gunshot, Thomas running from the house covered in blood, Clara's lifeless body. Her account painted a picture of chaos and confusion, but it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong inside the Morgan household. As the police searched the house, they found the weapon in the living room, hastily discarded, as if in a moment of panic. The gun was registered to Thomas Morgan, and its placement suggested that the shooting had been an accident, or perhaps something far more sinister. Fingerprints on the weapon would later confirm that it had been handled by both Thomas and Isabel. Detective Donovan's investigation quickly unraveled the complexities of the case. Thomas Morgan's relationship with Clara was revealed through text messages and photographs found on both their phones, showing the intimate connection that had been hidden for so long. It became clear to Donovan that this was no ordinary family dispute. The affair between Thomas and Clara, the tension in the house after Isabel's discovery, it all pointed to a tragic breaking point. Forensic evidence pieced together the sequence of events. The bullet trajectory indicated that Clara had been shot at close range, likely during a confrontation. Blood spatter patterns on the walls suggested a struggle, but there was no definitive proof of who had pulled the trigger. As the investigation continued, Thomas was nowhere to be found. A manhunt was launched, and within hours, police found his abandoned car just outside the city. He had fled, leaving behind the destruction of his family in the wake of the fatal moment. It didn't take long for authorities to track him down at a nearby hotel, where he was arrested without incident. The trial that followed was swift and devastating. Thomas Morgan was charged with second-degree murder, though his defense team argued that the shooting had been an accident, a confrontation that had escalated beyond control. But the evidence, combined with witness testimony from Beatrice and the digital trail left behind, painted a different picture. The court saw a man driven by guilt and desperation, his affair with his stepdaughter having led to an explosive fatal encounter. Isabel's involvement in the case was minimal. Though her fingerprints were found on the gun, it was clear that she had been a passive observer in the final moments. Consumed by her own grief and betrayal, she was not charged but would live with the weight of her daughter's death for the rest of her life. The neighbors, who had once admired the Morgan family's wealth and status, were left reeling in the aftermath. The perfect facade had been shattered, exposing the dark undercurrents of deception and tragedy that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. Beatrice, as the key witness, struggled with the emotional toll of what she had seen. She had been close to the family, always believing that they were the ideal picture of success and happiness. But now, she understood that appearances could be deceiving. The Morgans were no different from any other family, capable of great love and great destruction. The case left a lasting mark on the community, a stark reminder that no one is immune to the darker sides of human nature. The lesson, if there was one, was that secrets fester and lies inevitably unravel, often with devastating consequences. The emotions that had been buried deep within the Morgan household had finally exploded, leaving death and devastation in their wake. As for Isabel, the grief of losing Clara to a bullet fired in a moment of rage would haunt her for the rest of her days. She had once built her life on the foundation of family, but now that foundation was gone, replaced by the painful memory of what had been lost. The community of Marbella, once fascinated by the Morgans' wealth and status, now viewed their story as a cautionary tale. The perfect facade had crumbled, revealing the darkness that had been hidden within. Neighbors who had once admired the family now whispered about the affair, the betrayal, and the murder that had shocked their quiet, affluent enclave. The lessons from the case were stark but undeniable. Secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, have a way of unraveling, often with devastating consequences. The Morgans had been undone by their own lies, their inability to face the truth about their fractured relationships leading them down a path of destruction. In the end, the price of their deception had been paid in blood. As for Detective Donovan, the case left her with a familiar sense of unease. She had seen it all before. Families torn apart by secrets, by the failure to communicate, by the slow decay of trust. The Morgans were just another example, another tragic reminder that beneath the surface of every family, no matter how perfect they appeared, there could be a darkness waiting to consume them. The Morgan case would eventually fade from the headlines, replaced by new scandals and tragedies. But for those who had witnessed it up close, for Isabel, for Thomas, for Beatrice, and for the neighbors who had once idolized the family, the scars would remain. The lesson was simple but profound. No family is immune to the destructive power of secrets, and sometimes the truth, when it finally emerges, is too much to bear.